We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Suresh Naidu, who's a professor of economics and international public affairs at Columbia University, and also one of the country's leading experts on labor economics. And what we're going to talk about today, well, we'll talk about a lot of things with labor economics, but what I want to start with, Suresh is one of the few labor economists that look seriously at unions. I think there are more today than maybe 20 or 30 years ago. But in any case, he's certainly an expert on labor unions. So let's just start, you've done a lot of work recently on labor unions. So can you say, how you see, the benefits or downsides, you could say too, but benefits of labor unions for workers and for the labor market?
Yeah. So, I would say actually my primary identity for a long time and continuing is like as an economic historian. And so that's why you could study unions as an historian, because with 6% private union density, basically the place to go looking for like the really big impact of unions is historically in the 1930s and 1940s. And so my first paper on unions was one leveraging the fact that even though government statistics don't ask about unions until the 1970s, Gallup polls were asking about who was in a union and who wasn't as far back as the 1930s. And so we kind of cleaned up all of these Gallup surveys and was able to use that as kind of a way to measure make new estimates of who was in unions and how much were they making and all of these things going back to the 1930s, and kind of really showing that in this kind of heyday of American capitalism, if you will, of like high quality, high growth rates with 30% union density, the patterns of who's in unions, how much union members are making versus non-union members, the shifts in union density induced by the Wagner Act and World War II, all of these are consistent with there being kind of a real important role for unions in compressing the wage and income distribution. And so if you wanted kind of like some evidence that unions are not just good for union members, but also wind up compressing the income distribution as a whole, reducing inequality, and doing that over the whole 20th century, I think our paper provides some evidence on that. So I'm happy to sort of talk about that paper or talk about where that sort of took me into working with the contemporary labor movement.
Well, let's start with that paper. And again, what you made in passing is a really important point that, there was a conventional view within economics, I'm sure a lot of economists still hold it, that unions are good for union members. So they increase their wages for everyone else, but that could be seen as actually increasing inequality. So you have the union members that have their high pay, but then everyone else suffers from that because, they're paying more for their products. So, and your research, as I understand it, if I'm not misrepresenting it, goes the other way.
Yeah, and I think that's true. It's like Milton Friedman and many of many like mid '60s economists sort of thought, well, unions raise inequality because they raise the wage for union members, but then all those people that are not in the union get pushed out into the not covered sector with lower wages, and so that spread between union and non-union goes up, and that's like a contributor to wage inequality. But I think that reflects like a really mechanical and like not very realistic view of how the labor market works. And I think there's many countervailing forces by which unions, just by the nature of a collective bargaining agreement, restricting management's ability to give kind of arbitrary raises and attaching kind of, seniority profiles and attaching wages to particular jobs, that within unions, there's a lot of compression of wages that happen. And then I think what our paper sort of looks at and what other papers have sort of found, there's also a really important positive spillover of union membership on non-union workers. So if you're a worker that's not in a union, but you happen to be in a labor market with lots of other union members in there, there's like a positive effect on your wages. And that effect is sort of stronger at the bottom and middle of the distribution. And of course, if you're a high wage worker, you don't do as well when there's a lot of unions, because then one of the things is that it pulls down the top 10% share. Executives, I think so we don't have evidence on this so much, but I think it's really the case that when an executive has to sit across the table from a collective bargaining, from a union and bargain and open the books, that it just becomes like very politically costly to give the CEO an enormous pay package, because the union's like, what are you doing? And becomes less defensible.
Yeah, that's
so I
one
think
of the
there's
things.
many mechanisms like that kind of work. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the points, well, you've obviously written on this extensively, but one of the points that I think is underappreciated is that when we look at the rise in inequality in the last, half century or so, wherever we want to say it began, most of it, at least through 2000, almost all of it really was within the wage distribution. So if you look at the profit share to 2000, we could cut it different ways, but there really isn't a notable increase in profit shares by 2000. There has been since, but the big rise in inequality was from, however we want to date it, somewhere in the 70s to 2000. And that was before we saw an increase in profit shares. So again, not to say increase in profit shares hasn't been an issue, it certainly has been in the last quarter century, but that's not the main explanation for the rise in inequality.
Yeah, and it's important to connect that. I mean, in economics, kind of the too much of the focus is a little bit on this like college to not college wage gap, which is one of the big contributors. There's also the CEO pay explosion in that same period. So I would say those two things are kind of what's driving the wage inequality. And it's important to point out that unions kind of reduce both of those. So I think one of the patterns of our that we find in this paper is that even as union density went up and went down over the 20th century, the patterns of how unions set pay are very constant over time. So you get a bump if you're a union member, if you're covered by a collective bargaining agreement, you get somewhere between 10 and 20%. But that effect is really a lot smaller if you're highly educated. So that means that the returns to the educated from being in unions are a lot smaller than the returns from a less educated worker being in a labor movement, and that really compresses the wage distribution. And kind of part of our paper is also showing that the people that were really much more likely to be in the labor movement in this kind of post-war 25 years were less educated workers. So basically, union workers are much more likely to be selected from the people with less than college education. And as unions have declined, the people that are still in unions are the relatively educated. So it's exactly the selection out of the labor movement of the people that benefited most from unions that's kind of happened over time.
Yeah, that is striking. And I guess, and I don't know the details on this, but, where we look at countries that still have very high unionization rates, in particular, I'm thinking the Nordic countries, there you do have very high unionization rates, even among, the well-educated people. So it is a striking difference. And, as you're saying, that there's been some gains here among more educated people, but it's still not very promising, I guess I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way we kind of have this with Simon Yeager and Benjamin Schofer, we kind of have the survey paper of collective bargaining systems around the world. And it's a little bit like how a lot of European countries keep wages high is with just sectoral coverage. So you just extend an agreement negotiated between unions and employers associations, you just extend that to the whole sector. But then I think the way the Scandinavian countries maintain membership is that on top of the coverage that you get, being a member of a union gets you that the union negotiates on your behalf. You get kind of access to UI. You get a bunch of training things, and so they really make it so there's a tax break on your union dues, and so there's a bunch of other benefits that come along with being a union member on top of being covered by a collective bargaining agreement, and that's I think one of the mechanisms by which Scandinavia is able to keep up.
Yeah, extending a collective bargaining agreement to a whole sector, I think people may not be that familiar with it because obviously we don't have that here. But you want to say a little bit about how the mechanics of that works?
So it's actually, I think in the US, one of the big developments of the last few years has been the development of these kinds of sectoral bargaining arrangements in fast food in California. The context I'm most familiar with is nursing homes in Minnesota, which just passed a sectoral kind of bargaining arrangement. And the way these work is that you have a union that has or a workers organization that has to have some critical mass of membership inside that sector. And what it does, it meets with representatives of the employers and representatives of the government. And they meet every year and they come up with okay, here's going to be the wage set, the minimum wage, as well as wages that we're going to set for different occupations, give raises. and we're going to agree on this, and then the government is going to take the content of that agreement and kind of ensure that it's enforced for even the non-unionized employers in the sector, so that all workers, regardless of whether or not they're in a union or not, can get the benefits of this collective bargaining agreement. So the various details that have to get worked out. The interesting thing about nursing homes is that because all the funding comes from Medicare and Medicaid, there's kind of like needs to be like the terms of the wages needs to be consistent with what's in like the state budget for that sector, and that creates like a different level of bargaining.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You mentioned the California one, which I don't know if you work directly on that, but it's a very interesting story there. It's just, I think it's 2 years that's been in effect with the fast food. And, part of the hope, I think, for it is that in addition, obviously, they raised the wage for I think it's $20 an hour is the minimum in fast food.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's and this is against, I think, the statewide minimum wage is something like 18 now. So it's not.
Yeah. So it's funny. I think like the California minimum, like sectoral bargaining it's interesting as an experiment, but it's also like this is a state where the minimum wage already bites super close to where. So it's like the wage bump from the sectoral agreement is like going to be less because the minimum wage kind of cuts deep into the wage distribution there. But let's see how it goes. And I think one of the interesting hypotheses, I think this is where you were going with this, is that the model there is that, okay, by kind of passing this kind of sectoral bargaining thing, we can stand up, SEIU could like stand up something like a volunteer-ish workers organization where some small fraction of those workers covered by that agreement would kind of be willing to join kind of a nonprofit and maybe voluntarily pay some money into that. And that would be kind of a way of getting around kind of the employer opposition and just like knife fight that is organizing unions under the current NLRA, and try to instead kind of move to this different model where you're just trying to get like coverage for a large group and then hope that enough of them sign up that you can kind of get enough dues revenue to keep an organization going.
Yeah, no, it's a neat idea. And, again, I guess we'll see how it plays out. But again, there's less, if the, not that it's reasonable to expect employers are going to be happy with unions. I don't expect to see that, at least not anytime soon, or at least most employers. But it matters less to them. They're already paying their workers $20 an hour minimum. So it matters less to them if they get a union, and presumably a union will try to get better.
Yeah, so that's the theory of it, and I think that's like the theory behind it getting these sectoral bargains. I think there's two offsets there. One is that workers are just like, cool, I get the benefits regardless of whether or not I join, and so then we're kind of like in basically somewhat of a right to work environment where you kind of get the benefits of the coverage without having to pay any dues or join anything. So there's that. And then I think it's like there's something else that's like employers just hate unions independent of the wage effects. It's like the control, the like ability to kind of retain, like not having to deal with this third party. It's just like I think the control of the shop floor is as much of like anti-union sentiment as like the they don't like the wages for sure, but I think even if you take the wages out, they'll and I think now it's just in the culture of American employers to just go like tooth and nail against any kind of collective bargaining attempts.
No, it's sort of striking Elon Musk. I don't know if I could put this as a positive for him, but he's sort of useful in that he just makes it very clear. He wants to control his workers, be able to tell them, what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, and he does not want a union to interfere with that. And again, that's really, I mean, to my view, a very important thing that when we talk about something like overtime was killing me during the campaign, Trump's saying, oh, I'm pro-worker. We're going to have workers get paid time and a half for overtime. I'm sorry, tax-free for overtime. Their overtime is tax-free. And I'm thinking we put that in. Now, this is ancient history, but the Fair Labor Standards Act, a big part of the overtime premium was to discourage employers from forcing workers to work overtime, because that is the employer's choice. It's not, I mean, there might be a few places where they go around and say, hey, who wants to work extra hours this week? But the norm is, everyone's going to work, 48 hours this week. If you don't like it, go get another job. So from that vantage point, making it tax-free is 180 degrees wrong way. You want to help workers overtime? Make the wage premium instead of 50%, make it 75%, make it 100%, whatever. Give them more money. Don't Don't make it easier, more desirable for you.
Yeah. I'd love to see like if that tax cut, like how much of that is captured by employers would be kind of a great thing to sort of, you think you're cutting the taxes on overtime, but then the base rate wage kind of like falls, so that basically like workers see very little of that kind of take home.
Yeah. No, so it's I didn't have any good ins with the Harris. I mean, obviously I knew people in the Harris campaign, but I couldn't call her up and tell her, hey. But I just thought it would have been so great if she came back and said, make the premium 75%.
Yeah. Or I mean, we can talk about this, but it's just like why wasn't raising the federal minimum wage a major plank of that campaign? So I think you respond, you see this ridiculous tax cut idea, and you're like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to raise the minimum wage, and like that's polls much better, wins in red states, like even, and I think in this context of the past inflation, you can raise the minimum wage like pretty high federally, and it won't. Even red states with no minimum wage are just like their average wages are so far above this now that you could raise the minimum wage a lot, and you could overcome a lot of opposition because it's just we're in a different place.
Just to remind everyone, people have forgotten the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, right, at federal level. But there are very few people working anywhere close to that, because even though that's the legal minimum, even in, I don't know, Arkansas, not to make fun of it, but anyhow, they have lower wages, in the South in general. You'll find almost no one working at $7.25 an hour. So if you made it, and again, pulling this somewhat out of the air, but if you made the minimum wage $10 an hour, that one, I mean, it'd be a good thing to do, but that would not raise the wage for that many people, just because there are very few people working below that. So,
So we actually have this other paper about why wages with Aaron Dupay and Alan Manning. We have this paper about why wages bunch at round numbers. And it's that employers could kind of like it's not that workers are like confused. It's that employers are like, whatever, here's $10. And for a long time, the like modal wage, like the most frequent wage in a state is like just hovering around at $10, $10.00 exactly. And then you see this like transition suddenly to like $15.00. So they don't hang out in the middle very much. It's like they go from like round number to round number very, very much faster than any kind of like, neoclassical kind of theory would suggest.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I mean, obviously there's been, and you've done some of this, but there's been a lot of research on this that, again, the neoclassical theory taken strictly, we have employers, what's your marginal product? And, someone's at 10, someone's at 11, someone's at 10, each one, obviously nothing in the world corresponds to this, but, if we
have you just look at any actual wage distribution and you just see all kinds of like weird things that just doesn't make sense as like a pure marginal product explanation. Like this $10 thing. It's like nobody's like there's a spike in the wage distribution at exactly these round numbers. Probably marginal products shouldn't exhibit any weird spikes.
Again, to people who aren't economics nerds, that probably sounds very strange. But again, this was deeply believed, and again, I'm sure still many economists do deeply believe it, that wages correspond closely. And again, we'd all agree they correspond in some general sense. Like, we're not going to see a doctor working anywhere in the United States for $15 an hour. We're not going to see that. Their marginal product, however we want to put it, it's obviously considerably higher than that. So, there's some correspondence, but the idea that it's exact or anywhere close to exact, so that if we raise the minimum wage by 10% or 15%, we're going to throw all these people out of work. There's like nothing in the world to support that. And at this point, we have enough both experiments with the minimum wage and good research on it. We know that doesn't happen.
I think it's so two points on that. One is just you know this, but there is an older tradition of American labor economics that kind of was around in the early part of the up until mid 20th century. It was like a legit big part of labor economics that kind of had concepts that could make sense of this. So these were economists that like went out and ran surveys of firms that were involved in World War II labor board stuff. And they were like, one of the concepts they have to make sense of this is the idea there's a wage band. And like that, there's a big range around which you can set wages, and firms have a lot of latitude in how they set wages. And so you can kind of push around wages within this band with pretty much impunity. Of course, if we go outside the band, bad things can happen, but there is like this kind of band of wages around which there's like a lot of room for institutions and norms and minimum wages and collective bargaining agreements to all kind of operate without costing you a lot of employment.
Yeah, no, I was, when I was learning economics, we still saw some of that stuff. I remember, come back. I remember once I was stumbling on some stuff reading about the 60s, and I saw George Shultz, who of course became a cabinet. He was in, I think he was in Nixon's cabinet, and then Reagan's, of course. And he was in, I think he was Secretary of State. And it doesn't, not worth going into details, but it kind of surprised me. I went back and read, because I'm just pointing this out because he was certainly conservative. And yet he was very much writing in that framework.
Is that right? I did not know that. That's
No, he again, I don't know if he did any of the path-breaking work, but he was very much seemed to accept the idea of, wage contours and, that we didn't have, this, strict correspondence between marginal products and wages. When I was in grad school, it was kind of the heyday of that because it was, the rational expectations counter-revolution, I'd put it. And I had, on one of the earlier segments, I had Richard Freeman on. I was saying how much I was impressed by his book, What Do Unions Do? Because it was like, oh, they raise productivity, because it meant that, the idea was you were putting, and obviously Richard's done many subsequent works, but, the idea that you actually, there's a social process involved in production. It wasn't just that, here's person A and they have a marginal productivity, person B, they have, there's a social process involved. And,
Yeah. And actually, so that's a good segue right into, I think one of the concepts that's made all of this evidence kind of legible to economists with this idea that like employers have some wage setting power. And Richard actually in What Do Unions Do kind of has this point about like the way in which like unions reduce profits but raise productivity. And the way that one of the ways in which they do that, they do it through morale and kind of all these things, but they also do it through reducing turnover.
Yeah.
And what the kind of, so some background is like it used to be thought that monopsony was just like your company town, like a mining town where there's one company, it employs everyone, it owns all the real estate, like Columbia. But now it's kind of gotten to be that there's like a lot of evidence that just generically in the labor market, like it's hard to quit your job. And not everyone is sitting on top of like another job that they can easily move to. Very few people are. And because that it's just like hard to switch jobs, that gives every single employer a little bit of discretion in how they set wages. And so how are they going to use that? They're going to push wages down a little bit. They're going to suffer a little bit more turnover, but it makes sense for them to do that because they're making more profits. And what unions do in Richard's book, and in like this kind of my understanding of Richard's book in light of the research since, is that one of the mechanisms by which they actually raise this productivity is like they force employers to raise wages. And over some range, that can actually mean that turnover falls. And so, you're getting actually like more output and more sales and higher wages, and you're raising the overall output while reducing profits by exactly pushing wages above the like profit maximizing level.
Yeah, no, and that's an incredibly important point. And again, this point about monopsony, and again, I think this has really been drawn out in your work and others in the last, I don't know, two or three decades, that it's not just, you mentioned the mining town, you have a single employer, everyone, I think even Milton Friedman would grant, there's a large degree of monopsony. You have the mining town and the mining, they're far and away the predominant employer. But you have, even where you have a big city, you have a degree of monopsony power, even, restaurant that employs 30 people. There's still, this issue of monopsony power because people don't just pick up and leave because, they're paid, they think they should get 5% more because that's a big risk.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it is this like social relations at the workplace. You have to get along with your boss, your coworkers. It's got to work with your commute, with your childcare. Like a job is like a very complicated, high-dimensional object that needs to fit with you in various ways. And so substitutes in job space are like few and far between. And they can be close in space, but differ in many other dimensions. And all of that kind of creates this room for employers to kind of like have some discretion over the wage.
Yeah. And it's both that they have control, but also the other part, and again, I'm always struck by sometimes even economists, but when I talk to reporters, how frequent job switching is. So, if you look, and I'd argue with people about unemployment because there's a common thing to say, a few years ago when we had high inflation that, everyone pays higher prices, but, it's only, 4%, 5% of the workforce that's unemployed. So, naturally people are more concerned about inflation. You go, okay, it's 4 or 5%, ideally a little lower, but, whatever. That's how many people are unemployed. But if you look at the number of people who lose or leave their job every month, that's 5 to 6 million. So, you do the arithmetic on that. Now, many of these will do it 2 or 3 times over the year, but just straight arithmetic on that, you're talking about 60 to 70 million people. And it's a large share of the workforce that are in that situation where they either do leave their job or they're thinking about leaving their job. And obviously, the state of the labor market matters hugely. So if you have a tight labor market where they have good opportunities, they'll leave a job they don't like, they feel underpaid, whatever, they hate their boss. Whereas if, you have higher unemployment, they don't think there's opportunities there, they stay there. So it really does matter.
Yeah. And a key, I think, distinction within that is like voluntary versus involuntary separations. So that, there's people fired and there's people who quit. And one of the things is that even when you have, even in low wage labor markets, there's a high quit rate. So people are quitting a lot, but it's still not that sensitive to the wages of employers. So there's still a lot of like wage setting power, even at the bottom end of the labor market, even though people are quitting all the time. They're quitting because, things are happening in their lives that are like bad or like that make them quit. It's not because there's like it's not that they're like they're going to these like amazingly better jobs. It's they're cycling around and the wages and the extent to which they cycle around doesn't depend that much on the wage that they're paid. And so we're still kind of like, have some research kind of pointing to the presence of monopsony power even in the low wage labor market, even though there's lots and lots of quitting and these voluntary separations, it's not super responsive to the wage, and that's kind of the measure of monopsony power that employers that we kind of use in economics.
Yeah. So part of my point in bringing it up with the quit rates, and as you say, the obviously there's more turnover in low wage jobs. If you could reduce that, so if you instead of, again, even take something we think of as relatively unskilled restaurant work, there's still training costs, so if you could, the restaurant, I have to double check what the numbers here, but you probably have something like 7%, 6 or 7% of the staff turnover every month in a typical month. So if you reduce, your particular restaurant is able to reduce that by 10 or 15 percentage points. So 10 or 15% of the 7%, that makes a big difference because, that's, you don't have to, and again, it might sound stupid that, what's the training involved? Well, you have, you have to have, who puts the table out, how do they do it? Where do they bring the dishes? Again, that might all sound very simple.
They have to coordinate with the whole team of everybody that's there and like figure out how to do that. And that's I do think that there are these training costs. And there's been some research that suggests that like employers are kind of like unaware of the positive spillovers from reducing turnover. Like they don't set wages internal. Like when you talk to, they're just like not thinking about these margins when they're setting wages instead. So
I can believe that. Again, this goes back, again to the old days, the bad old days with rational expectations. So the idea that employers didn't know what was good for them, that was, and we really do see that in all sorts of different contexts. I had Julie Shore on a little while ago, and she's talking about 4-day work weeks, and she's found evidence that it actually increases productivity. So it makes up for, having people, and this is 4 8-hour days, so not 4 10-hour days. It's 4 8-hour days. They actually have higher total output, so much higher, per hour output. And, I'm saying, why don't, again, she has reasonably good data. I'm not going to say it's conclusive, but reasonably good data that, at least for many workplaces, that's the case. And she said, well, they're in their habits, which I think we should all be able to understand. But, the idea is that someone's running a big firm, they must know, and oftentimes they don't.
There's interesting, they do try stuff. I'm reading this book about how Kellogg tried the 4-day work week in the 1930s, and workers didn't want it. They were like, we want more hours and more pay. So that's like, that's interesting. It's and so they backed off and like decided to go back to the 5-day work week.
In her studies, they actually kept the same pay. So, they got a big pay increase, in fact.
Well, and total income. So it's still the same. Anyway, like they wanted, yeah.
Oh, I see. So I didn't realize Kellogg, I know the general story Kellogg's, I thought they actually had, they kept the same hourly pay, but, if you worked fewer hours, obviously take home less. But you probably know more about the details of that than I do.
Yeah. So I should not do this from memory. Yeah.
So let me ask you, we have in the news that Trump now wants to charge $100,000 on H-1B visas. And again, you keep changing because originally when they said it, it looked like it was going to be $100,000 per year. The way H-1B visa works, you get it for 3 years. An employer applies for it, not the worker. The employer applies for it. They bring someone in out ostensibly. And they can be there for 3 years, and then they can get a renewal for another 3 years. So when they originally were saying this, it sure sounded like they meant $100,000 per year, but then they backed off on that. And I think what they're now saying, it's going to be $100,000 per application. At least to me, it's not clear. Maybe they've said this somewhere, whether if you get a renewal, because it is very common to get that renewal, whether you pay it a second time or not. So what's your take on?
I first have a question, which is just, are these, so normally like universities and nonprofits are like exempt from the cap. And so there's like actually this whole way in which H-1Bs, are widespread in hospitals and universities because we're not covered by the cap. And I don't know if the 100K price is also binding on the nonprofit sector. And that was a question I had about it as not following it that closely.
Yeah, no, it's a very important point, and I'm not sure maybe they've written something up. They announced that they sound like a universal policy, but again, the way they were talking about it, they sounded like they were applying it to the corporate sector. But again, it might be one of these things that they hadn't thought through, and maybe they'll, who knows how they'll come down on it. So I'll just say,
and there was another proposal to actually do it with an auction, right? Like you auction off the H-1B visa, so firms have to bid. And so then that's like a way to make sure, but then that the only companies that are going to get it is going to be Google and Apple. Like basically, the largest companies are going to just kind of be able to outbid anyone else. And so I think that probably put them towards this $100,000 price. And I think there are ways in which H-1B workers have been used against native-born workers, and I think it would be like a mistake to not sort of at least be aware of that. Economists tend to, and I haven't researched H-1B visas in particular, I've worked much more on guest worker programs in kind of the UAE, and but they all have this feature that you're like tied to a particular employer, and so H-1B workers are often quite vulnerable to pay scales. In fact, there's kind of this very interesting paper on the H-1Bs that basically when there was like a slowdown in processing times for green cards. Mm-hmm. For like India and China in like the 2000s, that then you sort of saw that the H-1B workers were much less likely to get promotions. So basically it's like their labor market mobility was like they couldn't get green cards as quickly, and by staying on an H-1B, you're kind of trapped in this employer, and so your rate at which you can get outside options and do better in the labor market is just kind of turned off the longer you spend on the H-1B, and so they're definitely like a way for employers to keep wages replace native-born workers. There's supposed to be the H-1Bs, when you apply, you kind of put in for like an occupation and job title, and the Department of Labor will come back and say, here's the prevailing wage. Or you'll figure out the prevailing wage that you need to pay, and you have to pay above that. And that prevailing wage is supposed to be the wage for that kind of job. And when you look at the distribution of wages that employers kind of like put on the applications, there's a giant stack right there at the prevailing wage for that kind of job, which makes you think that they're like trying, if they could, they would like push it down even further. They can't. And so they're just all stacking up at the lowest possible wage that they can get away with for these types of workers. And so that makes me think that when employers are like, oh, well, we need the H-1Bs to get the best and the brightest and like all of that. Well, then like, why are you stacking up the applications at the lowest wage possible? That doesn't sound like you're operating in this like competitive market for like amazing talent. It sounds like you're trying to get a low wage workforce. So I think there's like merits to reforming the H-1B process for sure. I'm open to I would love us to have I haven't thought through it enough. What is the right way to trade off the interests of American workers with, people from much poorer countries that that in fact have a lot to offer the U.S. and would be kind of great citizens and very productive workers. Like, is there an actual institutional design of the U.S. either guest worker system or ideally in some ways, like, it might even be okay to have like fewer of the H-1Bs and just expand the green card process so that we're like letting in maybe as many people, but there's a real understanding that if you're coming in, you're like headed on a process towards citizenship if you want it, and much less of this kind of, okay, we're going to hold you down to this H-1B visa, and then we're going to send you back when this is expired. And so that means that also a lot of the money that's made by those workers gets sent back in remittances. So they're not like buying houses and investing and kind of scaling up the economy that could offset some of the negative labor market effects of guest worker programs. So I think like in some ways the guest worker nature of things, attaching people to one employer, really kind of prevents the economy from realizing the benefits of immigration in a way that a system that got much more in the way of permanent residence would kind of be able to realize more of the win-win gains from immigration, because it would kind of induce people to come in and like invest, our businesses, all of that stuff. And then we're kind of in the world where the economy just kind of scales up.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And, you know, in terms of the guest worker quality, they have, and I don't know the full details on it, they have liberalized it some, because I know originally, I don't know how far back the H-1B visa goes, but I know back in the 90s, you were tied to your employer. So you literally, if you quit, you lost your right to be in the U.S. Now, they have liberalized that, but it's still very difficult. I know that for someone to...
Yeah, you have like a 3-month, you have some window in which you can find a new employer.
So, you know, making that, you know, easier, you know, an easier process that would facilitate, you know, basically, you know, having a normal labor market that, you know, if you don't like your employer, you get a better pay, you know, you can go to another job. That should be a win-win. I mean, we should want that, because it'd be good for the economy to have the workers going where they're best used. I mean, right? And then obviously,
but it would come out of what employers could take.
Exactly. It wouldn't be a win for the employer, but or at least the employer that originally got the visa, presumably a win for the other employers. But no, it's unfortunate, because, you know, this is, you know, and it's obviously many people, maybe you've been talking about, you know, how you could reform H-1B, because there are issues. It's hardly an ideal program, but it's very hard to see this being in the right direction. And one point, you know, probably worth making in the context here, that they actually have a clause in there that employers could be exempted. So there's
so if you show up at Mar-a-Lago,
exactly,
you will probably be exempted.
Exactly. And this is the classic, you know, I mean, this is classic neoclassical conservative argument against things like this, is that you create special conditions. You know, same with tariffs. You know, okay, we're going to have a 50% tariff, but if you show up in Mar-a-Lago, we'll exempt you. You know, you give Trump a gold medal, he'll, you know.
I think this H-1B thing should be seen exactly like the tariffs.
Yeah,
it's like you know, there's a glimpse. It starts with like something that at a high level is like a good idea, but then you just realize it's getting used in this like crony, completely like arbitrary and ad hoc way. And you're like, you know, like if you had said raise tariffs for the U.S., I'm like, yeah, you know, there's a real solid case to be made for tariffs for various reasons. And but then, you know, like economists are like, but see, Trump is doing tariffs. This is what you wanted. And I'm like, no, because the premise of it was that there was like actually a democratic or like a process that was that you could like graduate things and like see how things were working, and not just kind of like some guy's opinion and how he's feeling in the morning determining these policies. And I think it's similar in the H-1B situation, is that, you know, there is probably room to raise the price for an H-1B for certain employers, and like to sort of curtail their use in some occupations, and maybe even expand their use in other occupations. We should be open to both of those things. But this administration, I doubt we're going to see anything that's like a reasonable reform process here.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know what, you know, again, I don't know the law on it well enough to know what sort of, again, I don't know what sort of discretion was intended in the law. And then the second part of that is what sort of discretion is actually going to be enforced. So, maybe there's very little I'm not going to claim to have studied the law or be a lawyer. So maybe there's actually little discretion in the way the program was structured, and Trump's just taking it. And then the question will be what the courts will say. Just as with the tariffs. I mean, most of us didn't think the president could just unilaterally set any tariff on any country he wanted, but that's what he's basically. I mean, that's what he's claiming is the right to do. I should just say.
Yeah. No, and I think like there's two parts of it, right? One is the Trump just like giving away the goodies. The other, I think, is like the larger, whatever you want to think about, if there is in fact a mega economic policy, they're like, oh, this is going to be good for American workers. But then it's always like the only way in which they're willing to think about policies that are good for American workers is when it's like punching down at some other country. It's never coming after like the American oligarchies. And so they're like, oh yeah, we're trying to do things that are good for the American worker, but like we want to make sure that we're like cutting Medicaid, and we're going to put in these tariffs that are going to be good for the American worker, but really they're like revenue that lets us offset the bond market's response to our tax cuts to the rich. And so it's just like this, like the economy as culture war, I think is just like the game. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Out of my domain. Although I should probably end on this like point of this. We have this paper with Ileana Kiziemko and Nicholas Lange-Marx where we kind of study the determinants of democratic realignment and how economic policy, like everyone thinks it's like culture versus the economy. And what we kind of show is that no, within the economy, there's a real split within the Democrats between supporting like labor market policy and tax and transfer policy. And if you want to really kind of get a handle on where the pivot of like college educated versus non-college educated voters towards the Democrats, when that starts, it starts in the 1970s when the Democrats start pivoting kind of away from like these New Deal policies towards like kind of a more tax and transfer focused redistribution. So think Atari Democrats. And so we're like, okay, there is still a real role in politics for economic policy to do some work. You just kind of can't just think about it in this sort of single domain of economic policy. So
that's a hugely important point. I realize I've pretty much used up our time here with you, but I just want to reemphasize that point that there's a distinction between saying, okay, we're going to raise the earned income tax credit, we're going to have child tax credit, good policies. I'm not knocking those at all; those are very good policies, but that's distinct from changing the conditions in the labor market that allowed working class people without college degrees to earn good wages. And we saw this shift in the Democratic Party that you're mentioning, and it accelerated in the 80s and certainly with Clinton in the 90s to focus on the latter, focus on the former, that, earned income tax credit, tax transfer policy, and basically say, okay, we don't care about unions. I'm being a little overstating it because they never.
I don't think you're overstating it at all. They literally say we don't care about unions, like repeatedly. And in fact, a punchline of this paper is actually one of the things that's happening is that union decline in this period is being made up for by the flood of both corporations and college-educated donors into the Democratic Party in the 70s with like campaign finance reform. And so the rise of these new Democrats is really like filling a vacuum that's coming because of the decline of organized labor. And that's kind of like, we didn't talk about it very much, but there's a real political economy component to what unions did that kind of changed the whole policy environment and goes beyond just the economic stuff.
Well, we got tough work ahead of us, but thanks a lot for joining us. I really enjoyed the segment, and
thanks a lot for having me.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.